walk me through what exactly is an October surprise?
Well, an October surprise is something that happens very close to the election day that potentially can influence the election result. I think it's a big deal in American politics. It's sort of a myth that somehow the opposing party, one of the two parties, is going to come up with some story or some event that will sabotage the other party's chances of winning. And there's always that fear that an October surprise is going to happen.
Is it so much the other party will come up with a story, or that a story will just be published from an outlet or what have you that impacts the election?
Well, that's a fair point. I think in reality, many events can happen, some unforeseen, something in foreign affairs, something from the media, but the fear always is that the other party is going to pull a dirty trick. That's always the fear.
So what are some examples of October surprises in American history?
Sure. Well, interestingly enough, the term was not invented until 1980, and it was a non-event. What happened was, remember this was during the Iranian hostage crisis, and so 53 Americans were held hostage for 444 days, and obviously this was hurting the Carter campaign. And so the Reagan campaign feared that the Carter presidency would come up with a deal to release the hostages at the last minute. And so William Casey, who was the campaign manager for Ronald Reagan at the time, during the Republican convention in July of 1980, told the media that they were expecting an October surprise, so that if it happened, it would look as if Carter, it was just a political move by Carter. But of course, it never happened.
When I was researching into this, it seems like October surprises, some years there's a bit of debate on whether there was one or not. Would you echo that sentiment?
I would echo that sentiment. I think many times there is not an October surprise, but oftentimes during the red hot times when we are in the middle of the campaign, anything that comes out that hurts either party, people are suspicious that it might be an October surprise. Remember, a successful October surprise would actually result in changing the election outcome, and I don't think that normally occurs.
Has it ever occurred?
Probably the best example I would say is in 2016. If you will go back and remember, this was the Hillary Clinton email scandal where she supposedly had saved some government emails on a private server. Well, the FBI had looked into it in May and June and July of the election year, and the FBI had pretty much said, mistakes were made, we don't think this rises to the level of criminality, we're done with this. But Congress continued to investigate, and then lo and behold, I think it was 10 or 11 days before the election, Comey sent, who was FBI director at the time, sent a letter to Congress saying, yes, we have found some additional emails, yes, we will continue to investigate. And the Clinton campaign to this day believes that that cost her the election. Comey, in a book he subsequently wrote, said that he thinks he was unconsciously biased by the belief that Clinton would likely win the election. And so it was his intention to make sure that those mistakes didn't happen again, but in actuality, he may have cost Clinton the election.
It seems like, when we're talking about October surprises, the belief is that, because something occurs so close to the election, it's
right.
like a recency bias.
Right.
People think about that.
I think that's right. And it's interesting whether those things can even affect today, because for a couple of reasons. One, we have the technology to respond to things very quickly. So if news breaks in the morning, it should be the case that the other campaign has a response to that by the afternoon, including all the surrogates that are talking on behalf of the campaign. Secondly, the October surprise, think of it like this. Michael, I think we ran into each other in the early voting line a day or two ago, and so by this time in the election, maybe a quarter of the electorate has already voted. So does a late October surprise even make sense? Maybe early October or late September surprise.
Do you feel that there's been a surprise, towards the end of this election season? Has there been an October surprise?
I have not seen an October surprise. I see the two cable news networks that I think are working closely with the Democrats have a news story on Trump every day, but it's pretty much old news. It's rehashed news, and so I don't see an October surprise on the horizon.
How much of an impact do these actually have on elections?
You know, it's hard to say because of the totality of everything that happens during an election season. My own feeling is they typically don't have a huge impact. What we typically see is that after the two conventions in the summer, we see movements in public opinion without a doubt in the polls, but then they sort of level off in September and October, and things don't move the needle too much after that time, partly because I think most people have made up their mind by then.
Let's say something happens towards the end of this election cycle that a lot of people start calling an October surprise. You know, and there's been a lot of belief that the country's quite polarized and there aren't that many undecided voters at this point. There's a lot of belief in that. Could an October surprise even impact the election at this point?
In my opinion, it's doubtful. I wouldn't say it's impossible. There certainly are some undecided people out there. We know that a few percent will break in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, but I think it is a dwindling minority of people that still have not made up their minds. And we in political science have a word for people that don't have their minds made up 2 weeks before the election. We tend to call those non-voters.
Let me ask you this question. In your time covering presidential elections, how does this one compare in terms of just the closeness of it? Do you even feel it's that close, or do you believe it?
I do believe it is close. I think this is going to be probably as close as any election we've seen in recent years. It reminds me a little bit of 2000, Gore versus George Bush Jr. I hope we know by election night. I hate to see votes still being counted and we don't know till a week after the election, but it could be that kind of election. I think it really is that close, and as you and I have discussed, it's probably down to 3 to 7 states at this point.
Is there anything else you'd like our audience to know?
Well, just a bit of history. Before 1980, there were October surprises. They just weren't called October surprises. In 1844, an abolitionist newspaper wrote a story about James K. Polk, who was a slave owner, by the way, from the South. And they referenced a book supposedly called Rohrbach's Tour of the Southern States in 1838 or something like that. And the implication was that not only was James K. Polk a slave owner, which everyone knew, but that he actually branded his slaves. And that was considered to be an attempt to influence the election. But it was very close, and Polk won by a very small majority. But for decades, it was actually referred to, the October surprise that was invented in 1980 was actually referred to as a Rohrbach. You tried to pull a Rohrbach, or you were Rohrbached. So it was somewhat famous for a few decades.